Hi class, my name is Gian,
And I'm John.
and we're here to talk to you about Delpit's Other People's Children.
Specifically, the third part of Other People's Children.
And our lecture will basically consist of the third chapter of Other People's Children, which is Education in a Multicultural Society.
But before that, we'd like to just give you guys a brief rundown, a synopsis of all three chapters contained in the third part, which starts with cultural confusions.
Page 135. To start off, Delpit starts talking about the assessment process developed and how it is biased to white people, white teachers, white educators, and the attempt to make a reform for multicultural examinations for teachers.
Yes. So, for instance, she sort of proposes the idea that possibly they can change the assessment tests for people to become teachers, considering that they might be culturally biased. So she presents that argument, but at the same time, she sort of says that maybe it's not the greatest idea, because if they were to change the test, and if minorities were still to perform poorly on that test, it would be a bad reflection of minorities altogether, and people might view minority teachers as being subpar as a result.
Yeah, as she says in page 136, thus, the more sophisticated assessment can result in a situation worse than the status quo, one that creates even more negative stereotypical assumptions about the people of color that is purposed to help. So she really means that if they create a new examination and the teachers of color still fail it, then that really reflects bad on them, because they created a whole examination based on their needs and the way they should approach examinations, and they're still failing it. So they will really apparently find a way to grab this examination that is supposed to help them and turn it against them. Think about that.
So then she goes on to further mention like different teaching styles of different ethnic groups, and she actually makes a pretty good she creates a pretty good metaphor of teachers sort of being similar to to preachers, in that preachers have something specific that they're trying to get across to an audience, and in many cases a scripture. But in order to get that point across to their audience, they have to be engaging.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, I thought it was a pretty good metaphor.
Yeah, she really looks at the other next profession that is the closest to being a teacher that can get a message across. So she looks at preachers and how even preachers have different style methods. If you go to a congregation down south full with a greater African American population, you see that their preaching method is not as contextual, but they interpret the scripture in a different way, and they address it to persons in specific persons in that audience.
Mm-hmm.
But when you see a different preaching method from a church in Massachusetts, you can see that they go strictly by the scripture. And this is based again on the people that they're addressing the preaching to,
mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm. So this sort of leads her to thinking about assessing teachers in general, and in pre-service educational programs, and how even there can be cultural differences between students, really. So students get into a classroom, there's somebody in the back of the room, just like we're going to experience ourselves. Somebody at some point 4 times a semester is going to be, critiquing us on how we relate to students, how we educate. So she sort of talks about that too, and how, the differences between people.
Yeah, and these people are going to be the ones who are going to criticize you based on the belief about what constitutes good teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And this varies across different cultural communities.
Sure.
You can have you can talk about the same scripture, you can have the same subject matter, but it really depends on who you are addressing this to that is going to make a difference as to how you deliver the message.
Mm-hmm.
And this will lead us onto a scientific study that she talks about being performed
at Stanford University,
yes.
Page 140 specifically. Yeah, sure. And actually, a lot of us went through this. Actually, when we read it, we kind of thought of how we sort of auditioned, in a sense, mm-hmm. for Woodrow Wilson. So how she sets it up is that students were asked to sort of just present on a familiar lesson to them. And they found that this one particular African-American teacher got up there and taught his familiar lesson to a group of students that he had never met before. And assessors said that the presentation or the lesson was illogical. It didn't make any sense. But later on, she goes to describe that a lot of African-American students, they
have the need to relate to the professor. They need to relate to the teacher because they have such a way of learning that she mentions that is really enclosed to personal relationships and interacting and touching, and it's just different for the way that Caucasian students learn.
Actually, it's on page 140, and she says that research suggests that children of color value the social aspects of an environment to a greater extent than do mainstream children, and tend to put an emphasis on feelings, acceptance, and emotional closeness.
Yes. So this person that was trying to teach a class to a group of students that he never met before, he was more focused in trying to get to know them than delivering the class. And Delpit says what his report is that he appeared incompetent because he vacillated between trying to establish a rapport to know and be known by students and attempting to teach the subject in hand.
Yeah, I mean, so Giancarlo and I were actually talking about this, that a lot of us might actually encounter this ourselves. I mean, like we mentioned before, we're all going to be critiqued at one point or another during this entire experience. Mm-hmm. And hopefully, I mean, our first time around, it might not go so great. We might not be able to, I mean, we might be rich in content, but we might not be engaging our students. So with any luck, you know, as in February or March or April, hopefully we can engage with our students a little more, you know, get to know them.
Yeah, but a great point that was made is, do you deliver your content just for the sake of teaching the material? Or do you try to first engage your students and get to know them? And once they're comfortable around you, you then start teaching the material. And you never know what you're going to get, because when you get assessed, they don't tell you what are your feelings about how the class went. Do you have to make any significant adaptations or changes to your plan? Do your students get the point? Instead, the assessments just go by the way of, do you identify the learning objectives? Was it effective? Do you discuss the history and ongoing contributions to students' life? Do you make reference to your weakness and strengths in teaching? So if it depends really on the kind of assessor that you get, whether you start off the bat and you either teach the content without knowing your students and you get a great score on your first assessment, but then your scores deteriorate as the year goes on because you never got the connection with your students. Mm-hmm. Or do you make the connection first and then your assessor just thinks that you don't know the material? It misinterprets the whole thing altogether.
Yeah, no, of course. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, Delpit, or Lisa Delpit, she feels that subject matter is certainly important, but it isn't the only thing. You know, it's not the only thing that's important. It's sort of like you have two mutually exclusive things, you know, subject matter plus engaging, but they sort of work hand in hand. And hopefully, you know, at the end of the day, hopefully your assessor is sitting in the background and understands that there's somebody up there teaching who has different styles and sort of is open, you know, and has like a pretty, you know, broad lens. So, yeah. You know, yeah.
And that's pretty
and that there's alternate concepts of teaching.
Yeah. So. And that right there is cross-cultural Confucians.
That was the first chapter.